So if we look at the year 1820, right as the Industrial Revolution is really starting to gain steam over in Great Britain, there's this one single country that accounts for a full one-third of the entire global GDP.
Yeah, which is just a staggering number to try and wrap your head around today.
Right. I mean, to put that in perspective, this nation's economy was 6 times larger than Britain's and almost 20 times larger than the brand new United States.
Exactly. For most of recorded history, it was the absolute center of economic gravity.
But then you fast forward just over a century, and that same country has its economy completely obliterated. I mean, liquid assets stripped, the national currency is utterly valueless, and commerce is literally reduced to people bartering for grain just to survive.
Yeah, it's a trajectory that breaks almost every conventional model of economic development we have. To go from that unprecedented peak down to absolute zero and then somehow engineer this multi-decade rise back to the top of the global order.
It's wild,
Yeah.
and it requires a system of mechanics that, honestly, most of the world still struggles to fully comprehend.
Oh, absolutely.
And that is exactly our mission today. So, welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive. We are taking a highly encyclopedic look at the economic engine of China, updated through early 2026.
And, we really want to cut through the daily noise with this one.
Right, the contradictory headlines, the geopolitical posturing. We want to give you, the listener, a comprehensive, clear-eyed view of how this massive machine actually operates. Because whether you're analyzing global markets for your portfolio or prepping for a supply chain strategy meeting or, just intensely curious about where the components of the device you're using right now actually came from, understanding the mechanics of the world's second largest economy is just non-negotiable.
Or the largest economy, depending on the metric you're using.
Right, exactly. By purchasing power parity, they are the largest.
And our approach today is going to be deeply analytical and strictly impartial. We're drawing from this incredibly detailed, comprehensive encyclopedia entry that maps out the entire spectrum of the Chinese economy.
It's a massive source.
It really is. And, we are dealing with complex political structures here and deeply debated economic systems. But our job isn't to take a side or endorse any particular viewpoint from the source. Our job is just to dissect the how and the why behind these staggering numbers. We're looking at the architecture of the system totally neutrally.
Okay, let's unpack this, because
Yeah.
I think we often treat China's rise like it's this purely modern phenomenon, right? Like it's just a product of the late 20th century.
Yeah, that's a really common misconception.
But if you look at the visual we've pulled up for this section, we've got this vibrant, multicolored line graph spanning 2,000 years, glowing in gold against this deep red background. It represents Angus Madison's historical GDP estimates. And it shows that the baseline isn't the poverty of the 1900s.
No, not at all. The baseline is deeply entrenched historical dominance.
Yeah.
You really have to picture a timeline spanning 2 millennia. For the vast majority of that time, from the 1st to the 19th century, an era scholars often call Pax Seneca China was the foremost economic power on the planet. Yeah, its agricultural output, early industrial base, those sprawling trade networks across Asia. It was this highly sophisticated, self-sustaining economic universe. So when we see those deep red and gold aesthetics associated with traditional Chinese wealth, they were backed by unmatched global output.
Right. But then comes the collapse. And I think we really need to understand the depth of that collapse to appreciate the modern machine.
Absolutely.
We move through the 19th century, the Opium Wars, foreign interventions, the Qing dynasty crumbles, and finally you have the absolute devastation of the Chinese Civil War. So by 1949, when the People's Republic of China is founded, what does the economy actually look like on the ground?
The source material is remarkably stark about this. It wasn't just a severe recession, it was a systemic vaporization of wealth.
Vaporization.
Yeah. At the end of the Civil War, as the defeated nationalist forces fled to Taiwan, they physically stripped mainland China of its liquid assets. They took the gold reserves, the silver, the foreign dollar reserves, everything.
Wait, so the new government basically inherited an empty vault.
Exactly. They inherited an economy where the national currency had lost all meaning. Without a medium of exchange, the entire economy just devolved into barter.
That is insane. So from 1949 to 1978, the country operates under Mao Zedong. And it's this highly state-led, centrally planned system, right? focused on heavy industrialization and complete self-sufficiency.
Right, but by global standards, it leaves the country profoundly impoverished. It was a period of intense trauma and rigid central control. The state dictated all the production quotas. They controlled agricultural output through these massive communal farms, and they totally isolated the domestic economy from global trade.
So by the late 1970s, despite some industrial gains, the vast majority of the population is just living in severe poverty.
Yes, which brings us to the massive pivot in 1978.
Right. Deng Xiaoping takes the reins and initiates economic reforms. And I want to pause here because we hear the phrase economic reforms and it sounds like this, boring bureaucratic adjustment.
Right, like tweaking an interest rate.
Exactly. But the reality on the ground was a fundamental restructuring of human incentives. How did they actually start this engine?
Well, they started with the absolute foundation of the country, which was agriculture. Under that communal system we just mentioned, farmers had literally zero incentive to produce more grain than the absolute minimum required.
Because the state just took everything anyway.
Exactly. The state took it all and redistributed it. So the reforms introduced what was called the household responsibility system.
Break down how that actually worked mechanically for me.
Okay, mechanically, the land remained owned by the collective, right? But it was contracted out to individual households.
Yeah.
So the state would say to a farming family, you owe us a specific quota of grain this year at a set price. But, and here's the kicker, anything you produce above that quota, you can sell on the open market for a profit.
Oh, wow. That is a massive paradigm shift. You're injecting a pure, unadulterated market incentive right into the base layer of a communist system.
Precisely. And the results were just immediate and explosive. Agricultural output skyrocketed. Suddenly, these farmers had actual cash. And with that cash, they started buying basic consumer goods, which then spurred the creation of small local factories to meet that new demand.
They called those township and village enterprises, right?
Yes, exactly. It was this incredible bottom-up wave of capital creation.
I always think of it like a massive coiled spring. I mean, for a century, the human capital, the sheer ambition and labor capacity of a billion people, was just tightly compressed by conflict and isolation. So 1978 wasn't just a policy tweak. It was the release of that spring.
That's a great analogy. And the upward kinetic energy that followed is unrivaled in economic history. I mean, following those initial reforms, China averaged a 10% annual growth rate for 3 solid decades.
10% every year for 30 years.
Double-digit growth year after year.
And the human impact of that growth is what's really staggering. The encyclopedia notes that between 1981 and 2019, the percentage of the Chinese population living in extreme poverty decreased from 88.1%,
Almost 9 out of 10 people.
down to 0.2%. From nearly everyone to statistically zero.
Yeah, between 1978 and 2018, China lifted 800 million human beings out of extreme poverty. 800 million.
That's more than double the entire population of the United States, just transitioning from subsistence farming into the modern global economy.
Right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it fundamentally altered global poverty metrics. It wasn't just a localized economic boom, it was a total rewiring of the global workforce and international supply chains.
Okay, but this is where I need to stop and ask the fundamental structural question. Because we're talking about farmers selling surplus grain, small factories popping up to meet consumer demand. I mean, that sounds like raw textbook capitalism.
It does, yeah.
Yet the official designation of the system by the Chinese government is a socialist market economy. And Western scholars call it authoritarian capitalism or party-state capitalism. So what is the actual operating system running this economy in 2026? How do you reconcile a communist political structure with a ferociously competitive capitalist market? Let's look at the visual we have here, the sleek 3D organizational chart with bright gears linking the central government, local governments, and SOEs.
To understand the operating system, you really have to look at the architecture of the state's involvement. It is definitely not a free market in the Western sense, but it's also not the rigid central planning of the Mao era. The core of this entire system is built around SOE's state-owned enterprises.
See, I always assumed state-owned enterprises were these bloated, inefficient relics of the past, like factories that were slowly being phased out.
A lot of people think that, but the encyclopedia makes it explicitly clear they are the absolute bedrock of the modern Chinese economy. The source notes there are over 867,000 enterprises in China with some degree of state ownership.
Over 800,000.
Yeah, and they generate roughly 40% of China's GDP. And account for over 60% of the country's market capitalization. Crucially, 91 of these SOEs are listed in the Fortune Global 500. We are talking about absolute behemoths in banking, telecommunications, energy, transportation.
But why? From a pure efficiency standpoint, why would the central government want to manage a commercial bank or an airline? Why not just privatize them completely and tax the profits like Western countries do?
Because the state doesn't view these enterprises purely as profit-generating entities. Academic Wendy Luter points out in our source that SOEs perform critical macroeconomic functions that a private company never, ever would. They act as the state's primary policy tools.
Okay, give me an example of how that works in practice.
Let's say the central government decides, through one of its top-down five-year plans, like the current 14th five-year plan, which focuses heavily on technological self-sufficiency, that China needs to build a massive, world-leading domestic semiconductor industry.
Okay.
Now, a private bank might look at that mandate and say, that's way too risky, the returns are a decade away, we are not lending you the billions needed to build those fabs.
Right, because private capital wants a return on investment within a reasonable time frame.
Exactly. But a state-owned bank doesn't have to answer to impatient shareholders. The government directs the state-owned bank to channel cheap capital into the semiconductor sector. It goes further. State-owned energy companies might be ordered to intentionally keep the price of electricity artificially low, specifically for those new semiconductor factories.
Ah, I see. So they are intentionally subsidizing the input costs.
Precisely. They keep input prices low to build up targeted sectors. They also act as massive shock absorbers for the whole society. During a financial crisis, a private company will lay off workers to save capital, right?
Right, to protect the bottom line.
But SOEs are often directed to maintain or even increase employment to prevent social instability. They just absorb the financial loss on behalf of the state. They control what are known as the commanding heights of the economy.
The commanding heights, like the crucial infrastructure that everything else relies on.
Yes.
Okay, I follow the logic. The central state acts as this heavy anchor. It controls the money supply, the power grid, the telecom networks. It lays out these massive five-year plans. But here's where the model breaks in my head, and I really want to push back on this.
Go ahead.
If you have this monolithic, heavily bureaucratic central state dictating the direction of the economy, how on earth did China become this wild, fiercely entrepreneurial powerhouse? I mean, look at cities like Shenzhen or Hangzhou. They are buzzing with startups, private innovation, and cutthroat competition. Central planning and rapid innovation are historical enemies.
They usually are, yes.
So how is there any room for the private sector to breathe?
That is the defining paradox of the Chinese economic miracle. And it introduces a concept from the source that is absolutely vital for anyone trying to understand this market. The prominent scholar, Yuan Yuaneng, characterizes this specific system as directed improvisation.
Directed improvisation. I mean, that sounds like an oxymoron.
It does, but it perfectly describes the dynamic between the central government in Beijing and the thousands of local governments across the country. Think of it less like a traditional rigid government hierarchy and more like a massive, high-stakes corporate franchise model.
Like a fast food franchise.
Conceptually, yes. The central government is corporate headquarters. They set the overarching goals, the direction. They decree, we need to hit 5% GDP growth, or we need to become the global leader in solar panel production. That is the top-down mandate. But corporate headquarters does not micromanage how the local franchise owner actually gets customers in the door.
So the local mayors and the provincial party secretaries, they are the franchise owners.
Yes, and they are given immense autonomy to achieve those central goals. They are the ones improvising from the bottom up. And here is the real kicker. Local officials are essentially pitted against each other in this fierce, winner-take-all competition.
Because their personal political careers are on the line.
Exactly. The party operates a deeply entrenched promotion tournament. If you are a local mayor and your city's GDP grows faster, attracts more foreign investment, and builds better infrastructure than the neighboring city, you get promoted to a higher provincial rank. If you stagnate, your career is basically over.
Wow. So these government bureaucrats are practically incentivized to act like venture capitalists.
They absolutely are. They fiercely compete to attract businesses to their jurisdictions. They travel the world courting foreign executives. They build custom industrial parks, and they offer incredible financial incentives. The encyclopedia mentions this famous policy known as 3 tax-free and 3 half-tax.
How does that actually work mechanically?
A local official will approach a promising tech company or manufacturer and say, look, if you build your new factory in our city, you will pay absolutely 0 corporate income tax for the first 3 years of operation. And for the 3 years after that, You will only pay half the standard rate.
That's a massive incentive.
Huge. And they might also throw in deeply discounted land rights and, expedited permitting.
So you have the central state acting as this heavy stabilizing anchor over banking and energy, ensuring the system doesn't collapse. But on the ground floor, you have thousands of local officials wheeling and dealing, slashing taxes, and bending rules to build a private sector engine.
Right. And that private sector engine is the true wealth creator here. Despite the dominance of the SOEs and the commanding heights, private businesses in China contribute roughly 60% of the national GDP, provide 80% of urban employment, and are responsible for 90% of new job creation.
90% of new jobs. That is fascinating. The state relies almost entirely on the private sector for job growth.
It does.
But that relationship isn't always harmonious, right? I mean, we've seen some serious friction over the last few years. In the early 2020s, there was a massive, highly publicized crackdown on the biggest tech monopolies. I remember when Alibaba was hit with that record $2.8 billion antitrust fine.
Oh yeah, that made huge waves.
From the outside, it really looked like Beijing was deliberately kneecapping its most successful entrepreneurs just to prove who is boss.
It certainly sends a chilling effect through global markets. The central government grew very concerned that these massive tech platforms, companies with unprecedented control over consumer data, finance, and logistics, were becoming too powerful. They worried it could potentially destabilize the financial system and challenge state authority. They wanted to rein in what they called the disorderly expansion of capital.
But reading through the 2025 and 2026 updates in our source material, it seems like the landscape has shifted yet again. Like they realized they went too far.
They realized that you cannot achieve technological self-sufficiency, which is their primary geopolitical goal right now, if you destroy the very companies driving that innovation. By 2025, the government really moved from unpredictable, punitive crackdowns to a more stabilized, institutionalized form of regulation.
Right.
Xi Jinping even made a point of publicly meeting with tech leaders, emphasizing that private firms are an indispensable part of China's future.
But they didn't just return to the Wild West days of unregulated growth. They engineered a new method of control. I really want to talk about golden shares because this is a brilliant and honestly terrifying piece of corporate mechanics. Explain what a golden share is.
Also known as special management shares. This is a highly surgical tool for state control. Instead of nationalizing a tech company or fining it into oblivion, a state-backed fund will quietly purchase a tiny equity stake in a key subsidiary of that tech giant, usually just 1%.
See, a 1% stake in Western corporate governance means practically nothing. You cannot dictate terms with 1%.
True in the West, but in this system, that 1% comes with a bespoke legal agreement. That single golden share grants the state a seat on the board of directors and, crucially, veto power over specific, highly sensitive business decisions.
Like what kind of decisions?
Such as how consumer data is routed, the underlying logic of content recommendation algorithms, or the appointment of key executives. Yeah, it allows the state to embed itself directly in the nervous system of the private tech sector. It's really the ultimate synthesis of party-state capitalism. It allows the company to remain privately owned and globally competitive, while ensuring its core operations never, ever conflict with the state's strategic goals.
That is an incredibly delicate dance. They are trying to micromanage the boundaries of innovation without extinguishing the fire. But this entire system we just outlined, the local mayors acting like VCs, the promotion tournaments, the state oversight, it relies on one thing to function: accurate metrics of success,
Right.
which brings us to a massive underlying vulnerability in everything we've discussed so far: the data itself. Let's look at this visual of real satellite imagery of China at night, pulsing data points showing light pollution intensity juxtaposed over official GDP bar charts.
Ah, yes, the data dilemma. This is perhaps one of the most fiercely debated topics among global economists today.
Let's follow the logic. If you have a system where thousands of ambitious local officials are fiercely competing for promotions, and those promotions are based almost entirely on the GDP growth they report to Beijing, doesn't that create a massive systemic incentive to just lie, to completely cook the books?
It creates an overwhelming incentive, and the central government is acutely aware of this. This isn't just Western skepticism. It's a huge internal political issue. Xi Jinping has explicitly stated that economic data forgery is a severe problem that undermines the party's ability to govern accurately.
There is a famous anecdote in the encyclopedia that perfectly encapsulates this. It involves former Premier Li Keqiang Back in 2007, before he was the premier, he was the party secretary of Liaoning province. And a WikiLeaks cable revealed a conversation he had with an ambassador, where Li frankly admitted that the GDP numbers coming out of the provinces were man-made and unreliable.
Yes, he essentially said they should be used for reference only.
It's a startling admission. The man who would eventually run the country's economy didn't even trust the official economic data. So to manage his own province, Li Keqiang created his own alternative metric, which economists later dubbed the Li Keqiang Index.
Exactly.
What did he measure if he wasn't measuring reported GDP?
He looked at physical, verifiable outputs that are incredibly difficult to fake. He measured electricity consumption, the volume of rail cargo, and the disbursement of bank loans. Because if a local mayor claimed the local economy grew by 15%, but the power grid showed no increase in electricity usage and the freight trains were running empty, knew the mayor was lying.
So if the internal data is historically suspect, how do external economists, the people building global financial models, figure out what is actually happening inside China?
They've had to become incredibly creative, developing independent proxies for economic growth. And one of the most fascinating methods involves space. Economists like Hunter Clark, Maxim Pinkovsky, and Xavier Sala Martin have utilized high-resolution satellite imagery to record nighttime light pollution across China over time.
I absolutely love this concept. I think of it like trying to judge the size of a bonfire in the distance. You have a guy standing right next to the fire yelling, "Trust me, the flames are 100 feet high."
Right.
You can take his word for it, or you can step back, look at the forest surrounding the fire, and independently measure exactly how much light is being cast onto the trees. The satellite data is measuring the light on the trees. As cities expand, build new factories, and work night shifts, they inherently emit more light.
It's a brilliant, objective physical variable. You cannot easily fake the lumens your city emits into space. Researchers also rely on value-added tax, or VAT, data, because VAT is collected at every single stage of production and requires matching invoices between buyers and sellers. It is highly resistant to systemic fraud.
Right.
And finally, they look at trading partner data.
Right, because if China says they exported $100 billion worth of goods to the European Union, the EU's customs data should show $100 billion worth of goods arriving.
Yeah.
You can just cross-reference it.
Exactly. But when economists apply these independent proxies, the satellites, the VAT, the trade data, the conclusions they reach are deeply fractured. There's no consensus. There are highly respected institutions on both sides of a massive debate regarding the true size of China's economy.
We really need to lay out both sides of this argument clearly, because if you, the listener, are trying to forecast global demand for raw materials or understand supply chain capacities, this discrepancy matters immensely. Let's start with the skeptics, the camp that says the Chinese economy is actually much smaller than officially reported.
A prime example of this perspective comes from the Rhodium Group, which is an independent research firm. In their analysis of 2024, they estimated that China's actual GDP growth was somewhere between 2.4 and 2.8%.
Which is drastically lower than the official government claim of 4.8% for that year. They're essentially saying the growth rate is cut in half.
Yes. And looking retrospectively, a highly cited 2019 paper from the Brookings Institution utilized that value-added tax data we just discussed. They concluded that local governments have been systematically overstating investment and industrial output.
By how much?
Their model suggested that China's economic growth may have been overstated by about 1.7% every single year between 2008 and 2016. Compounded over time, that implies the actual economy could be 12 to 16% smaller than the official figures suggest.
12 to 16% smaller. That is trillions of dollars of phantom wealth.
It is.
But there is a counter-argument, right? And honestly, this is the part that surprised me the most. There are respected Western economists who argue that China's economy might actually be underestimated. Why on earth would the Chinese government underreport their own success?
Well, it's not necessarily intentional underreporting. It's a structural limitation of their statistical gathering apparatus. China's Statistical Bureau was originally built to track heavy, state-owned industry, literally counting steel girders and tons of coal. It is incredibly difficult for any bureaucracy to accurately capture the explosive growth of a chaotic, digitized private sector.
Oh, right. How do you accurately measure the economic value of 84 million gig workers in a platform economy or massive underground service sectors?
You often just miss them. A study by the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco found that when you correlate China's official GDP with verifiable external measures like imports and exports, the official numbers are remarkably consistent, suggesting growth wasn't slower than reported.
Interesting.
Furthermore, researchers from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Daniel H. Rosen and B.B. Bao, published a study showing that due to uncounted real estate and service sector activity, China's actual GDP in 2008 was likely 13 to 16% larger than the official data.
So you have the Brookings Institution saying it's 16% smaller and CSIS saying it's 16% larger. That is a massive margin of error for the world's second largest economy.
It is very murky, but let's bring it right up to the present day, to 2025 and 2026. Amidst all this intense global skepticism regarding China's post-pandemic recovery, the United States Federal Reserve conducted deep, independent economic research to verify if China was actually hitting its stated 5% growth target.
And what was the verdict from the U.S. Fed?
They concluded that the Chinese official figures were not overstated. The U.S. Fed found that alternative indicators, specifically physical trade volume, consumption proxies, and property sector data, closely aligned with the official 5% figure.
Wait, how is that possible, given the massive real estate crisis we've all read about? If housing is collapsing, how are they maintaining 5% growth?
The Fed's report highlighted the sheer brute force of China's supply-side economy. Yes, domestic consumption was weak, and the property sector was a massive drag. But China compensated by turbocharging its manufacturing output for international trade. Their factories were simply outproducing the domestic slump.
Which leads perfectly to the core takeaway for the listener. Does it actually matter if the spreadsheet says 4.8% or 5.2%?
For most practical purposes, no. The absolute decimal point matters far less than the verifiable physical reality. You can debate the accounting all day, but you cannot debate the cargo ships leaving the ports, the deep water infrastructure being built, or the physical goods flooding global markets.
Let's talk about that physical reality, because what China is actually making and the scale at which they are making it has evolved dramatically. Look at this visual we're showing, high-definition, rapid-fire imagery of advanced robotics, gleaming high-speed trains, vast arrays of solar panels, all tied together with this vibrant red and gold color grading. We've established they are the factory of the world. China's industrial output exceeds the industrial output of the next 9 largest manufacturing nations combined.
Think about that scale for a second. Add up the manufacturing sectors of the United States, Japan, Germany, South Korea, India, and 4 others. China still produces more. They manufacture approximately 20% of all the industrial products on planet Earth.
But the narrative around Made in China is undergoing a violent shift. Historically, the prevailing thought in the West was, China makes the cheap stuff, we make the advanced stuff. And historically, that was true. The encyclopedia notes, somewhat humorously but accurately, that China produces roughly 70% of the world's sex toys. They dominated low-wage sectors, clothing, textiles, cheap plastics, basic assembly.
And that low-wage manufacturing was entirely intentional. It was the crucial first step on the developmental ladder. They leveraged their massive, cheap labor force to build initial capital reserves and global logistics infrastructure. But they never, ever intended to stay at the bottom of the value chain.
Exactly. And the way they climbed that ladder involved a very specific and highly controversial mechanism, the joint venture requirement. Break down how that worked, because it sets the stage for everything they're doing today.
So in the 1990s and 2000s, global corporations desperately wanted access to the rapidly enriching Chinese consumer market. If a Western auto giant, let's say Volkswagen or General Motors, wanted to sell cars in China, Beijing instituted a strict rule. They said, you are welcome to sell here, but you cannot own your factory outright. You must form a 50-50 joint venture with a domestic Chinese state-owned automaker.
And the unspoken, or often explicitly spoken rule of that partnership was technology transfer?
Precisely. The Western companies had to share their blueprints, their engineering processes, and their management techniques with their Chinese partners. For the Western executives, it was a calculated trade-off. Give up some intellectual property in exchange for billions of dollars in short-term sales.
But the long-term consequence was that China effectively went to school on Western engineering for 2 decades. They learned how to build the supply chains, how to machine the parts, and how to scale production. And now, they aren't just copying, they are aggressively out-innovating.
They currently spend about 2.6% of their massive GDP purely on research and development. And they have strategically targeted the industries of the future. Look at the green energy and electric vehicle revolution.
This is the pivot that the rest of the world is desperately trying to respond to right now. As of 2023 and 2024, China isn't just a participant in the green transition. They are the undisputed hegemon. They are the world's leading producer of solar panels and wind turbines.
The dominance is absolute. Chinese companies currently control approximately 80% of the entire global production chain for the solar industry. From refining the polysilicon to manufacturing the wafers to assembling the final panels, if any country in the world wants to transition to solar energy, they're almost mathematically required to purchase Chinese components.
And the automotive sector is perhaps the most visible example of this leapfrog strategy. For a century, the internal combustion engine was dominated by Germany, Japan, and the US. China realized they could never catch up in traditional engine manufacturing, so they completely bypassed it. They subsidized battery technology and EVs, and the results in 2024 are staggering.
In 2024, China manufactured 31.28 million vehicles.
31 million cars in a single year.
And crucially, they exported 5.86 million of them. That volume officially made China the world's top automobile producer and the top automobile exporter, finally overtaking Japan. They absolutely dominate the electric vehicle market, not just in final assembly, but in the critical mineral refining and battery supply chains that make the vehicles run.
And they are backing this advanced manufacturing with a terrifyingly efficient digital infrastructure. The consumer adoption of technology in China is light years ahead of many Western nations.
It is a fundamentally different digital ecosystem. China has the highest number of technology unicorns, privately held startups, valued over $1 billion in the world. They lead the globe in mobile payments.
Apps like Alipay and WeChat Pay have made physical cash practically obsolete in major Chinese cities. I mean, even street vendors use QR codes. And this digital ubiquity has spawned a massive platform economy.
The platform economy encompasses ride-hailing, food delivery, and gig work logistics, dominated by giants like Tencent and Alibaba. As of 2020, 84 million people worked in China's platform economy. It serves as a massive employment sponge, absorbing workers who are transitioning out of traditional low-wage manufacturing.
Okay, let's take a breath. Because listening to us map out this machine, the 80% solar dominance, the 31 million cars, the 84 million digital gig workers, the state funneling capital into semiconductors, it sounds utterly invincible. It sounds like an unstoppable economic juggernaut that will simply consume the global market.
If you stop the analysis right here, that is exactly the conclusion you draw. But it would be an incomplete, fundamentally flawed picture of the reality on the ground in 2026.
Right, because to build this machine, they had to run the engine at a dangerously high temperature. Which brings us to the shadow side of the miracle, the internal imbalances that are threatening to fracture the system from within. Let's step into the pressure cooker. We have this striking infographic of a towering, precarious skyscraper made of gold coins juxtaposed with a shrinking demographic pyramid.
The most immediate existential threat to the Chinese economic model is the real estate sector.
Real estate in China isn't just a sector. It is the absolute foundation of middle-class wealth and local government finance. It accounts for roughly 20% of the entire Chinese economy. But to understand why it's a crisis, we really have to explain why the Chinese public is so uniquely obsessed with buying property.
It comes down to a lack of alternatives. The Chinese government maintains strict capital controls. It is incredibly difficult for an average citizen to legally move their money out of the country to invest in, say, a broad U.S. index fund or European bonds. Furthermore, the domestic Chinese stock market has historically been viewed as volatile and akin to a casino by many retail investors.
So if you are a rising middle-class worker in Shanghai and you want to protect your savings from inflation and build generational wealth, your options are severely limited.
For decades, the only safe, socially acceptable, and reliable way to build wealth was to buy an apartment. And once you paid that off, you bought a second apartment. The cultural expectation of homeownership is immense. Currently, 90% of urban households in China own their home.
Let me use an analogy to explain the risk here. Imagine a person who takes 60% of their entire life savings and dumps it into a single, highly volatile tech stock.
Any financial advisor would tell you that violates every rule of risk management and diversification.
Exactly. But on a national scale, that is the reality. Real estate accounts for a staggering 60% of all Chinese household assets. Because everyone was pouring their life savings into concrete, the market inflated to an almost incomprehensible size. The Wall Street Journal reported that at its peak, the Chinese housing market had grown to a $52 trillion market.
The 52 trillion.
That is significantly larger than the U.S. housing market right before the 2008 financial crisis.
And the central government, recognizing the catastrophic systemic risk of this bubble, intentionally tried to gently deflate it by tightening credit to massive developers. This sparked the sprawling property sector crisis of the mid-2020s, characterized by unfinished apartment blocks and defaulting developers.
But the real estate bubble is just the most visible symptom of a deeper disease. Debt. The sheer amount of leverage holding the system together is staggering.
If we look at the total non-financial debt in China, combining corporate debt, household debt, and government borrowing it, has reached a massive 312% of GDP. Household debt alone, driven almost entirely by those apartment mortgages, has crossed 60% of GDP.
But the most dangerous pocket of debt involves something we mentioned briefly earlier. The local governments. We talked about how local mayors acted like venture capitalists, building industrial parks and infrastructure to boost their GDP. But the central government historically didn't allow local governments to run massive budget deficits. So where did the mayors get the money to build the roads and bridges?
They utilized a mechanism known as LGFEs, local government financing vehicles. This is a crucial concept to understand the shadow banking system in China.
Okay, explain exactly how an LGFE works. Trace the money for us.
Imagine a local mayor wants to build a new multi-billion-dollar subway line to boost local GDP, but his official municipal budget is totally empty. He cannot legally borrow the money as the city government. So, the city creates a legally distinct corporate shell company, the LGFE.
Okay, a shell company. But a shell company has no assets. How does it get a loan?
The city transfers ownership of vast tracts of empty municipal land to the LGFV. Now, the LGFV is a corporation with billions of dollars of real estate assets on its books. The LGFV goes to a state-owned bank or a shadow lender and says, we have all this valuable land as collateral, lend us money to build the subway.
The bank makes the loan, the LGFV builds the subway, the local GDP spikes, and the mayor gets promoted.
Precisely. But here's the problem. The subway line doesn't generate nearly enough ticket revenue to pay back the massive loan. So the debt just sits there, perpetually rolled over, legally off the official books of the local government, but implicitly guaranteed by the state.
It's weaponized bureaucracy. They used collateralized dirt to print money for infrastructure. And now, those LGFEs are sitting on trillions of dollars of hidden debt right as the land values they used as collateral are plummeting because of the real estate crisis.
It is a precarious financial tightrope, and the government is attempting to navigate this massive debt deleveraging right as they are hit with an entirely different, arguably unsolvable crisis: demographics.
The population pyramid is crumbling at the base. China currently possesses the world's largest labor force, sitting at roughly 773 million workers in 2024. But that number is shrinking. The society is aging rapidly.
This is primarily the long-term legacy of the one-child policy. The government officially ended the policy, eventually removing all family size limits by 2021, but the demographic die was already cast. The birth rate has plummeted, meaning fewer young workers are entering the economy to support an exploding population of retirees.
But logically, if the labor force is shrinking, shouldn't that be great for the workers who are there? I mean, basic supply and demand suggests a labor shortage should lead to higher wages and incredible job security for young people.
You would assume so, but the reality on the ground is a severe structural mismatch in the labor market. China's universities have been pumping out millions of highly educated graduates over the last decade. But the economy, which is still heavily reliant on manufacturing, and the now stagnant tech platform monopolies, is not producing enough high-skill, white-collar jobs to absorb them.
The numbers detailing this youth employment crisis are alarming. In 2023, the official youth unemployment rate measuring 16 to 24-year-olds hit 21.3%.
And that was just the official number before the government temporarily suspended the release of the data to revise its methodology. Independent estimates from prominent Chinese professors and analysts suggested the true youth unemployment rate, including those who simply gave up looking for work, could be closer to 46% or even 50%.
Half of the educated youth unable to find meaningful career track employment. And you can see the societal pressure boiling over into cultural movements. I want to talk about the Tangping movement.
Tangping, which translates to lying flat.
Explain the psychology behind lying flat.
Imagine you are a 23-year-old graduate in Shenzhen. You have studied relentlessly your entire life in a hyper-competitive education system. You graduate, But the only jobs available demand the grueling 996 schedule, working 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week for relatively low pay. Meanwhile, you look at the housing market, that $52 trillion bubble, and realize you will literally never be able to afford an apartment, meaning you can likely never afford to marry or start a family.
So the traditional social contract, work hard, buy a house, get ahead, is fundamentally broken for them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So instead of participating in a rat race they cannot win, a segment of the youth simply opts out. They lower their material desires, they move back in with their parents, they reject the crushing work culture, and they lie flat. It is a passive, silent strike against the economic pressure cooker.
And it throws a harsh spotlight on the lingering inequality within the system. We rightly praised the eradication of extreme poverty earlier. Moving 800 million people out of subsistence farming is historically unparalleled. But eradicating extreme poverty does not mean you have created a wealthy, egalitarian society.
No, it does not. Former Premier Li Keqiang explicitly highlighted this in 2020 when he stated that 600 million Chinese citizens, nearly half the population, still live on a monthly income of roughly 1,000 yuan. At current exchange rates, that is about $143 a month.
600 million people living on $143 a month. That is the reality behind the gleaming high-speed trains. And the wealth gap is widening. Economists use a metric called the Gini coefficient to measure inequality. A score of 0 means perfect equality. A score of 1 means one person holds all the wealth.
China's official Gini coefficient hovers around 0.47, which is a medium to high level of income inequality, placing it higher than many developed Western nations.
So let's synthesize the tightrope the central government is walking in 2026. On one side, they have to deliberately deflate a $52 trillion property bubble to reduce systemic debt risk, but they must do it slowly enough that they don't wipe out the life savings of the middle class, which would trigger mass social unrest.
Correct. And on the other side, they must rapidly transition the entire national economy away from cheap exports and real estate toward high-tech innovation in EVs, while simultaneously trying to invent enough high-paying white-collar jobs to appease millions of disillusioned, lying-flat graduates.
And they have to do all of this while carrying a total debt burden of 312% of their GDP. It is a macroeconomic puzzle of terrifying complexity. But here is the crucial connection for you, the listener. This pressure cooker doesn't just vent steam inside China's borders. These internal dynamics, the excess industrial capacity in things like solar and steel, the desperate need to find new markets to sustain growth and employment, they violently spill over into the global economy.
Which brings us to the final dimension of our analysis, the global spiderweb, how the internal mechanics of China interface with the rest of the world. We've got this beautiful, glowing global map showing golden supply chain lines radiating outward from China to ASEAN, Europe, and Latin America.
To understand the global impact, we have to start with trade dominance. The glowing lines of those supply chains are thicker and more far-reaching than ever. China is the world's largest exporter, moving $3.77 trillion in goods in 2025.
They're also the second largest importer, meaning their domestic demand dictates global commodity prices for things like copper, soybeans, and oil. They are the largest single trading partner for over 120 countries. They anchor the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which ties together the economies of the Asia-Pacific into the world's largest free trade area.
But wait, if I turn on the financial news today, the dominant narrative is about decoupling or de-risking. We constantly hear stories about how geopolitical tensions, U.S. tariffs, and the supply chain shocks of the pandemic have convinced Western corporations to abandon China. We hear about Apple moving iPhone assembly to India, or furniture manufacturers setting up shop in Vietnam, or auto parts suppliers building plants in Mexico. The narrative is that the world is leaving China behind.
The encyclopedia data provides a vital, counterintuitive nuance to that popular narrative. It introduces the reality of what is called the China plus many strategy.
Walk me through what that actually means. Are these companies leaving or not?
The answer requires us to trace the underlying supply chains. Yes, the data shows that between 2018 and 2023, there were hundreds of documented corporate decisions to relocate final assembly plants away from mainland China. However, a vanishingly small percentage, only about 15% of those moves were reshoring, meaning bringing the manufacturing back to the United States or Europe.
So the factories didn't go to Ohio or Germany. They went to developing nations like Vietnam, Mexico, and India.
Correct. But here is the critical data point that shatters the decoupling myth. 67% of those relocated factories still relied heavily on their existing Chinese suppliers. In the case of Mexico, roughly 90% of the capacity shifts went to companies utilizing their existing supply networks.
Let me make sure I'm fully grasping the mechanics of this. A Western corporation moves its final assembly plant from Shenzhen, China to Monterrey, Mexico, primarily to avoid U.S. tariffs and claim they're diversifying their supply chain. But the factory in Monterrey isn't building the product from scratch. They are still importing the batteries, the electric motors, the specialized microchips, and the process materials directly from their old suppliers back in Shenzhen.
Precisely. They import the intermediate components from China, perform the final lower value assembly in Mexico or Vietnam, and slap a Made in Mexico label on the box. So
Mhm.
China is not losing its grip on the global supply chain. It is simply lengthening it. They're exporting their manufacturing ecosystem. The deep roots of the supply chain, the capital, the advanced components, the intellectual property remain firmly Chinese.
That is wild. The spider web isn't breaking, it's just casting a wider, more complex net to bypass geopolitical roadblocks. Think about the last diversified product you bought that said, Made in Vietnam. The reality is, the beating heart of that product was still manufactured in Guangdong.
And this expansion isn't just happening through trade, it is happening through massive state-directed capital deployment. China remains a top global destination for inward foreign direct investment, but more importantly, Chinese companies are heavily investing abroad.
This is driven by official state policies, right? The Go Out policy and the massive Belt and Road Initiative.
Yes. The Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, is arguably the largest infrastructure and investment project in human history. To understand how it works mechanically, you have to look beyond the idea of traditional foreign aid.
Right. Give me a concrete example of how a Belt and Road deal actually functions on the ground.
Let's look at a typical infrastructure deal in a developing nation, say a port facility in Sri Lanka or a railway in Kenya. The host country needs infrastructure but lacks the capital. China approaches them and offers a multi-billion-dollar loan. However, the loan doesn't come from a Western institution like the IMF. It comes from a Chinese state-owned policy bank.
Okay, so the state bank loans the money, but there are stipulations attached.
Crucial stipulations. The loan often requires that the host country hire a Chinese state-owned construction company to build the project. And that Chinese construction company will import Chinese steel, Chinese cement, and often Chinese engineering labor to complete the build.
Wow. So the money never really leaves the Chinese ecosystem. The state bank issues the loan, but the capital is immediately paid out to Chinese industrial companies. It's a mechanism for China to export its excess industrial capacity, keeping its domestic steel mills and construction firms employed, while simultaneously indebting foreign nations and securing geopolitical leverage over strategic infrastructure like ports and railways.
It is a brilliantly integrated macroeconomic strategy, and it is complemented by aggressive corporate acquisitions. The encyclopedia details massive mergers and acquisitions executed by Chinese firms globally.
What kind of companies are they buying?
They are acquiring strategic assets across the board. For example, the state-owned ChemChina purchased the Swiss agrochemical giant Syngenta for a staggering $41.8 billion. Chinese firms have acquired major stakes in global logistics firms, tech distributors like Ingram Micro, entertainment companies like AMC Theaters, and legacy manufacturing brands like Pirelli Tires in Italy.
What is the strategic logic behind spending tens of billions on legacy foreign brands?
Several reasons. First, acquiring established global brands allows Chinese companies to bypass the stigma historically associated with Chinese consumer goods. Second, and more importantly, it is a rapid method of acquiring advanced technology, proprietary patents, and top-tier global talent. Why spend 20 years trying to innovate a new chemical process when you can simply buy the Swiss company that already perfected it? And finally, owning the foreign asset outright allows them to bypass trade barriers.
So, when we step back and view the global picture in its entirety, China is the world's largest exporter. They anchor the center of Asian free trade. They are systematically expanding their supply chains into places like Mexico to evade tariffs. They are using state loans to build global infrastructure that relies on Chinese industry. And they are buying up strategic corporate assets and intellectual property around the world.
That is the true anatomy of the global spiderweb. It is an economy deeply, irrevocably integrated into the daily functioning of the rest of the planet.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. And looking at our final visual backdrop, this serene view of the Great Wall morphing into a futuristic neon-lit data stream. I want to synthesize this encyclopedic journey because the scale of what we've discussed can feel overwhelming, but it follows a profound logical arc.
It really does. We began by establishing the historical baseline, The sheer dominance of the Pax Sinica era and the absolute vaporization of that wealth by 1949, leaving a country operating on barter.
We examined the release of the coiled spring in 1978, the introduction of the household responsibility system that injected market incentives into a communist framework, triggering a three-decade economic miracle that lifted 800 million human beings out of extreme poverty.
We looked under the hood at the mechanical paradox of directed improvisation.
Hmm.
We saw how the central state maintains a grip on the commanding heights through massive SOEs, subsidizing targeted industries, while local mayors engage in cutthroat venture capital-style competition to attract private business.
We waded into the murky waters of the data dilemma, exploring how the pressure to get promoted incentivizes local officials to massage the numbers, forcing economists to rely on satellite light pollution and physical trade volume just to verify the reality of the growth.
We spotlighted the aggressive industrial pivot, the transition from the world's factory for low-wage plastics, leveraging decades of forced technology transfers, into an undisputed, high-tech hegemon controlling 80% of the global solar supply chain and dominating the electric vehicle market.
But we didn't ignore the shadow side. We stared into the pressure cooker of a system built on leverage, a $52 trillion real estate bubble propped up by trapped domestic capital, a staggering 312% total debt-to-GDP ratio obscured by shadow banking LGFEs, and a youth unemployment crisis so severe it birthed a cultural movement of lying flat.
And finally, we saw how that immense internal pressure forces the Chinese economic machine to push outward, expanding its supply chains and utilizing state capital to secure global infrastructure and strategic assets.
This matters to you, directly and personally. Whether you are looking at the persistently high interest rates on your mortgage, pricing out the electric vehicle you want to buy, or trying to understand why your company's supply chain is shifting to Mexico. The levers that are being pulled in Beijing are sending shockwaves directly into your daily life and your financial portfolio. You simply cannot navigate the modern global economy without understanding the mechanics we've dissected today.
Which leaves us with one final fascinating thread to pull on. A thought that builds on the collision of the data points we've analyzed, but pushes us into the immediate, highly unpredictable future.
Lay it on us.
We established that China's labor force, currently at 773 million, is shrinking rapidly due to irreversible aging demographics. For years, Western economists have viewed this demographic collapse as China's fatal flaw, the ultimate ceiling on their growth. We also know, from our sector analysis, that the state is aggressively pouring capital into AI, robotics, and advanced automation.
Right, they are preparing for the industries of the future.
But if we connect those two realities, a profound possibility emerges. What if the demographic crisis isn't a fatal weakness? What if the rapid disappearance of cheap human labor is actually the exact catalyst that forces China to execute the fastest, most comprehensive robotic transition in human history? If they simply do not have the young bodies to stand on the assembly lines, they have no choice but to rely on algorithms and machines.
Wow. So the necessity of a shrinking, aging population acts as an accelerant. It forces them to bypass human labor entirely to maintain their industrial dominance.
Exactly. It raises a provocative question for the coming decade. Will the historical factory of the world, an engine built on the backs of 800 million rural laborers, soon become a hyper-efficient, AI-driven leviathan with virtually no human workers at all?
A completely automated superpower. That is a chilling, awe-inspiring thought to mull over. Thank you for joining us on this custom-tailored deep dive. We hope this encyclopedic journey has given you a clearer, sharper lens through which to view the mechanics of the global economy. Keep questioning the headlines, keep analyzing the underlying data, and we'll leave you to ponder what that fully automated factory of the future might look like.